They looked like America's most wholesome family, a widowed dad, his quirky best friend, a cool rock and roll uncle, and three little girls growing up under one roof. Week after week, millions tuned in not for plot twists or scandals, but for something far rarer: comfort. Full House wasn't just a sitcom, it was a cultural safety blanket, a place where every disaster was followed by a hug, a piano underscore, and a life lesson tied with a bow. But while the show preached stability, the real world around it was anything but stable. Behind the cameras, something was shifting, something no one watching at home could feel. The network executives were quietly growing restless. Audience trends were turning. Pressure was climbing. And within the cast and crew, there were whispers. Not of scandal, not of betrayal, but of something more dangerous to a show built on sugar-sweet predictability. The sense that the world that created Full House was disappearing right under its feet. Even at its peak, when it sat on top of household ratings and turned child actors into household names. The doom clock had already started ticking. Meetings were happening in closed rooms. Decisions were being made without the cast. On set, people began noticing subtle changes in tone, in schedules, in the way producers spoke. Something was coming. They didn't know it yet, but a moment was approaching, one decision, made far away from the Tanner house, that would pull the plug on this seemingly indestructible empire of wholesomeness. And when that decision finally hit the cast, it didn't just end a show, it blindsided them. For the actors, life inside Stage 24 at Warner Brothers felt eternal. They were raising children together, watching birthdays and graduations, spending more hours with each other than with their real families. Candace Cameron later admitted that she didn't even realize how famous she was during those years. The set was her world. Bob Saget once said that the show felt like a marriage where no one imagined divorce. That was the illusion: 8 seasons of routine, predictability, and paychecks that never bounced. But off camera, the temperature of television was changing fast. Grittier sitcoms were emerging. Writers' rooms across Hollywood were throwing out the heartwarming lesson formula and replacing it with sarcasm, edge, and controversy. Full House suddenly looked quaint, cute, safe, and safe in television is one step away from obsolete. Ratings were still strong, but executives weren't just watching ratings, they were watching what was coming next and what advertisers were beginning to demand. Inside production offices, you could feel it before you could name it. More notes from the network, more pressure to freshen the tone, more hesitation about renewing another season. Crew members whispered that the budget conversations had turned cold. Cast schedules were being questioned. Even John Stamos recalled sensing that something was off, though no one told them why. The cast kept filming as if everything was normal, not knowing that conversations determining the fate of the show were already happening without them, and skyscrapers they'd never stepped into. Oh, the night before the final decision was made, the cast had no clue they were living the last days of a show that defined a decade. There were still storylines being drafted for season 9. Wardrobe was already prepping future costume racks. They were operating under the assumption that the machine they had built would keep running, because why would something at the top just stop? But it was about to stop, not slowly, not gently, but with one quiet announcement that none of them saw coming. The atmosphere shifted for the first time on what seemed like an ordinary production day. Phones were buzzing more than usual. Assistants were walking faster. Producers were pulling people aside instead of speaking openly. Cast members later said they could sense something was wrong, the way you sense a storm coming even before the first drop hits. No one knew why, but everyone felt it. Then came the private meetings, the kind that never happen while a show is safe. Cast weren't invited, not even the leads. What made it worse was the silence outside those doors. No one emerged looking relieved. No one came out smiling. The writer's room, normally a noisy hub of jokes and chatter, turned into a library of hushed voices and anxious glances. Something was being finalized. At this point, the cast still believed they were negotiating routine renewal logistics, salary bumps, scheduling, network reshuffling, maybe a time slot change. Nothing that screamed end of an empire. They continued filming scenes filled with laughter and canned applause, completely unaware that what they were shooting might never air in the context they expected. And then came the summons. The entire cast and key crew were told to gather, not on set, not in the writer's room, but in a closed meeting space where sitcom families don't normally assemble unless something irreversible is about to be said. People walked in with half-finished coffees, scripts in hand, presuming a schedule update or a press announcement. Instead, they looked around the room, studying faces, and realized from the tension alone that whatever they were about to hear would change everything. Before anyone spoke, there was a silence that didn't belong in a sitcom environment. No one cracked a joke. No one tried to lighten the mood. Even Bob Saget, the one who could diffuse any room, sat still, waiting. John Stamos later said you could feel the oxygen leave the room before a single word was spoken. The producers looked like people who had been carrying a secret too heavy for too long. Finally, the announcement began, not with an explanation, not with discussion, but with a statement so blunt it stunned the room into stillness. Season 8 would be the last. No negotiation. No, we'll revisit later. Final. Absolute. The Tanner house, America's fictional home, was being locked. The first reaction wasn't anger, it was disbelief. Jodie Sweetin stared ahead like she hadn't processed the sentence. Candace Cameron thought she'd misheard. Mary-Kate and Ashley, still too young to fully grasp the business behind the show, just watched the adults' faces trying to read them like mirrors. Nobody cried right away. Shock always arrives first. When the shock began to peel back, questions flooded forward. Why? Who decided? Was it ratings, contracts, creative fatigue, money, politics, image? Something internal? Something external? Something preventable? Something buried? But the producers, in that moment, didn't answer. They just delivered the verdict and let the weight of it sink into a room full of people who had built their lives around something they assumed was permanent. The cast walked out of that room differently than they walked in. Now, not a single one of them expected to be carrying the death of the show on their shoulders that day. And yet the reason it ended, the real reason, was still being held back from most of them. In the days after the announcement, information began to leak not from the producers, but from people on the periphery. Assistants overheard calls, network staff whispered to crew, agents started making quiet phone inquiries, and slowly a pattern emerged. This wasn't a creative ending, and it wasn't a ratings collapse. Something else had been brewing, something bigger than anything happening on set. For the first time, cast members learned that conversations about ending the show had been going on for months while they were still filming scenes, doing press, and assuming a 9th season was a formality. The decision, it turned out, hadn't come from the people who wrote the lines or built the sets. It came from much higher up, far above the creative side of the industry altogether. The closer people looked, the clearer it became. This was not an emotional decision. It was a strategic one. Not a reaction, a calculation. Documents were already circulating. Deals had already been drafted. The slot on the network grid, that Full House occupied a slot it had earned through years of dominance, was already being eyed for something else. Something newer, riskier, louder. Something executives believed represented the direction television was about to turn toward. And the most shocking part? The cast eventually discovered that if one single factor had tilted in the opposite direction, Full House would have continued. There was a condition, a pivot point, a circumstance that sealed their fate long before they knew they were in danger. Everything ended not because the show failed, but because one specific trigger behind closed doors set the fall in motion. The trigger wasn't scandal, infighting, exhaustion, or even declining ratings. The cast later learned the truth in pieces. ABC, the network that aired Full House, had already made a corporate decision to spend its money somewhere else. They had purchased rights to launch a brand new primetime drama, NYPD Blue, and that single acquisition changed everything. The moment ABC committed to pushing a new, edgy direction for their lineup, grittier, more adult, more modern, the fate of Full House was sealed. The show was still delivering strong numbers, but executives no longer wanted wholesome. They wanted controversy. They wanted headlines. They wanted what Full House by design could never become. To make room for the new direction and to free the massive budget tied to one of the most expensive family sitcoms on air, executives quietly chose to cut the show, not because it was weak, but because it no longer matched the future they wanted to buy. When John Stamos later said, "We didn't get canceled, we got replaced," he wasn't exaggerating. The blow deepened when the cast realized something even colder. If Warner Bros., the studio, had agreed to move the show to a cheaper network like the WB, it would have survived. The producers tried. They negotiated. But ABC refused to release the show to a competitor even though they had no intention of keeping it. They took Full House off the board, not just to end it, but to make sure no one else could profit from its loyalty and success. And that's how an 8-season cultural giant died. Not from failure, not from scandal, not from creative burnout, but from a boardroom decision to pursue a different identity. No final argument. No second chance. Just a shift in taste at the top, and a show that defined a decade was treated like an antique in a store that decided to sell steel instead of wood. When the cast filmed the final episode, they knew it wasn't a finale born of closure, it was a funeral born of calculation. They hugged on screen, wiped tears off camera, and walked away from a set that could have run for years, if not for one industry truth. In television, success doesn't guarantee survival. It only buys time until someone, somewhere, decides the future belongs to something else. And for Full House, that decision had already been made long before the audience ever knew the end was coming.